privilege to welcome all of you to our spring lecture series. It is not my assignment to introduce the lecturer, as that will fall to one of our students, Anthony Hopgood, who is even now busily finishing up the last parts of his introduction. But I do want to express appreciation on the part of the Colgate-Rochester-Crozer Divinity School family for the presence of each one of you that has taken the time to register, to come out, and to be a part of the first of the lectures that will continue both today and Wednesday and into Thursday. Before we go any further, let's find out who we have in the room, beginning with alumni. If there are any of you who are graduates, would you stand up so we can, or raise a hand, or whatever is easiest for you. Let's give that all of our alums. Thank you all for coming back. Now, I do this every year. Ken Dodson is in the class of 1948. Is there anybody here who was in an earlier class than 1948? If not, your award goes again to Ken. So, let's now meet present and former faculty of the school, if we have any faculty here, present or former. Let's greet all of them. Special word of greeting to Paul Hammer, who's in the back row, professor of New Testament, and still very much a part of the life of the school. And then all of our current students, if you are presently enrolled, would you please raise your hands? Interested neighbors, folks who just like CRCDS. Last but not least, the wife of the lecturer. Let's have the wife of the lecturer stand up so we can So we're happy to have all of you here. I hope that you will be blessed by all of the events of today and Wednesday and Thursday. Thanks for coming. We look forward to seeing you as the days unfold. I now yield to Anthony Hopgood, who will make the presentation of our lecture.
Let us give our president a hand. Since protocols have been established, I have the task of standing before you. And I love standing before you to talk about this particular gentleman. I met him at American Baptist College a while back, years ago. He don't remember, but I remember him. So he'll tell you that he doesn't remember me. I'm trying to get a grade for the class. I asked him the question. I said, well, I've been asked to stand and introduce you for the lecture. He said, well, I'll send you something in the email. I'm still waiting on that email. So as I prayed about it,
hold your grade.
Hopefully what the Lord has given me is going to help out. I prayed about it, and I prayed about it, and the word came to mind is tenacious. Tenacious. And I looked up the word tenacious. Tenacious is holding fast, characterized by keeping a firm hold, highly retentive, a tenacious memory, holding together, cohesive, not easily pulled asunder, tough. A man, a pastor, an educator, a scholar, past president of Colgate-Rochester Divinity School, Alexi Hall, Crozer Theological Seminary, the past president from 1990 to 2000, 10 long years, the founding pastor of St. Luke Tabernacle Community Church here in Rochester. I can go on and I can go on. But main thing is, he's a child of God.
Amen.
Amen. So I present to some and introduce to others, none other than Dr. James H. Evans, Jr. Hear ye him.
Amen.
Let me thank Brother Hopgood. I just informed him that so far he's at a B+. He's in good shape. He's in good shape. I want to thank him for that introduction, and certainly want to again acknowledge the presence and leadership of our President, President Whitman, and all of you who are gathered here. It's really wonderful to see faces of friends and former students. I have to say that I've been here long enough that it seems like everybody graduated last year. People come up and say, well, I graduated 10 years ago, 15 years ago, might as well have been last year. So, that's how fresh your contribution is to my memory. I also want to thank my faculty colleagues for the invitation to bring this lecture. It's certainly counted an honor to be able to do so. It is a topic about which I would speak often superficially, but this invitation gave me the opportunity to really delve into this subject matter. The title of the lecture is I Come to the Garden Alone, the earthy spirituality of black folk. There is a hymn, and I'm sure that you know it. I come to the garden alone while the dew is still on the roses, and the voice I hear falling on my ear, the Son of God discloses. And he walks with me, and he talks with me, and he tells me I am his own. And the joy we share as we tarry there, none other has ever known. This hymn was one of the favorites among the saints of the Second Gethsemane Missionary Baptist Church in Detroit, Michigan, where my father was the founding pastor. Its refrain was always rendered with plaintive notes and an almost dirge-like rhythm. And while I had not yet come into my theological maturity, there was something incongruous about it. With its pastoral allusions and subtle celebrations of nature, it seemed out of place in the hard urban landscapes of the city. Perhaps it was a reminder of the ground that these migrants from the South left as they sought a better life in the North. In later years, I began to wonder about this garden. Where was it? Whose was it? What was its purpose and function? The fact is that this garden is shrouded with a certain theological ambiguity. I believe, however, that this potent symbol holds one of the keys to understanding a major paradox in African American religious experience, and that is the relationship between the spirituality of black folk and the earth. The relationship between being black and dwelling upon this earth has become one of the more important issues among African American intellectuals. For the purposes of this lecture, I want to explore the image of the garden as a gateway to understanding the ecological challenges that black people face as the issue of the sustainability of the earth moves to the forefront. There are 3 prominent gardens mentioned in the Bible, each of which I believe can be seen as a symbolic expression of the ambiguity that black people experience when it comes to the realm of nature. The first is the Garden of Eden, described in the Genesis narrative. This garden has become a defining trope in the Christian imagination. This garden is most often viewed as an original paradise where all of God's creations dwell together in perfect ecological and moral balance. Both in the popular imagination as well as in formal theology, this garden is the site of both self-discovery and divine encounter. Perhaps the most well-known example of this insight is the conversion story of St. Augustine. In his Confessions, the garden is a site of self-discovery and redemption. In Book 8, Section 8 of his narrative, he describes his anguished search, which takes place in a garden. There was a garden, he says, attached to our larder. To this garden, the storm in my breast somehow brought me. For there no one could intervene in the fierce suit I had brought against myself. But there I was, going mad on my way to sanity, dying on my way to life, aware of how evil I was, unaware that I was to grow better in a little while. Augustine's quest in the garden became an archetypal image in much of spiritual literature in early Christian thought. His subsequent influence on the history of Christianity raised his story to near canonical status, and it became a pattern followed by later writers. The 16th century mystic Teresa of Avila used the image of the garden to provide a stamp of credibility to her spiritual journey. She expands Augustine's notion of the garden as a momentary stop on the way to self-discovery and describes her garden as a part of the process of self-discovery. She says, "Let us now consider how this garden can be watered, so that we may do what we have to do, that what labor it will cost us, and if the gain will outweigh the labor, and for how long this labor will be borne." The garden can be watered in 4 ways, she says. One, by taking water from a well, which costs us great labor, or by bucket and water wheel, when the water is drawn by a windlass, she says, which requires less human labor, or by a stream or a brook, which requires even less human labor, or by a heavy rain, which requires no human labor, for rain proceeds from God. It is worth noting that Teresa emphasizes that the garden requires care and stewardship, while for Augustine, it is the inert context for his spiritual goals. However, in both instances, the garden contributes and aids in the process of spiritual self-discovery. This garden is Edenic because through the process of self-discovery, both Augustine and Teresa assert their encounter with God. The second garden is the Garden of Gethsemane. In the church of my childhood, a tapestry hung on one of the walls depicting Jesus weeping and praying in Gethsemane. The power of this image of Gethsemane was significant enough for it to be included in the name of the church. But not only was it an image within the sanctuary, it was also an image which shaped many of the painful testimonies shared therein. The image of the garden suggests the experience of embrace and intimacy, but also of abandonment and agony. Here Jesus struggles with the contradictions between human will and divine purpose. He experiences concurrent moments of intense love and utter alienation, which finally resolve into existential surrender. In his 1845 narrative, Frederick Douglass describes his escape from slavery. And while he intentionally omits the details of his escape, because the path he used to get to freedom was still an active conduit to liberty, he uses the image of the garden, which contradicts and ultimately destabilizes the idyllic notion of the Garden of Eden prevalent in the Christian imagination. He describes one of his overseers, Colonel Lloyd, who kept a large and finely cultivated garden, which afforded almost constant enjoyment of employment of 4 men. It abounded in fruits of almost every description. This garden was not the least source of trouble on the plantation. Its excellent fruit was quite a temptation to the hungry swarm of boys as well as to the older slaves, few of whom had either the virtue or the vice to resist it. Scarcely a day passed during the summer but that some slave had to take the lash for stealing fruit. The colonel had to resort to all kinds of stratagems to keep the slaves out of the garden. The last and most successful one was that of tarring the fence all around, after which, if a slave was caught with any tar upon his person, it was deemed sufficient proof that he had either been into the garden or had tried to get in. In either case, he was severely whipped by the chief gardener. This plan worked well. The slaves became as fearful of the tar as of the lash. They seemed to realize the impossibility of touching tar without being defiled. Douglass's description of the garden takes into account the political dimensions of the image. Another description is found in the writings of Black Shaker elders Rebecca Jackson. In her spiritual autobiography, she describes her vision of a garden. Like Augustine, she comes to enlightenment in a house that has a garden. Quote, "This house into which I entered was the kingdom to which I was bound. The garden was my fallen nature. These berries was the fruit upon which my carnal propensity subsisted. My person was my soul. My picking was my soul taking active part in all its pleasures. So I found the Lord was a teaching the way of life, and I was very careful after that about picking or eating anything that I know would feed my fallen nature. Here for both Douglas and Jackson, the garden is a site of pain, confusion, inner and outer turmoil. It reflects the pattern of the New Testament image of Gethsemane, as Jesus struggles with the intractability of sin and absurdity of evil in the world. It is the place where sweat and tears moisten the soil, as the meaning of human existence before God recedes. It is also a place of surrender and complete dependence, without the assurance that one's hope for a future will bring redemption. The third garden is the one mentioned in John 19, verses 41 and 42. It is the garden beside Golgotha. Now in the place where he was crucified, there was a garden. And in the garden, a new sepulchre, wherein never was a man laid. There they laid Jesus, because of the Jews' preparation day, for the sepulchre was nigh at hand. It is in this garden that the drama of life, suffering, abandonment reaches a critical point. Here, the very ground that was the site of both self-discovery and of great deception, the ground that was the site of both abandonment and surrender, become the site of a cosmic act of rectification and reconciliation. Here, Jesus is interred. He is put into the ground. He is enveloped and embraced by the earth itself. It becomes the seedbed for a new birth and a new creation. Enslaved Africans and their descendants, in ways large and small, affirmed this understanding of a garden through their burial rituals. Grave sites were holy places, not because they enabled cherished memories of departed loved ones, but because they were the gateway to a new dimension of life. Art historian Robert Farris Thompson, in his classic work, Flash of the Spirit, African and Afro-American Art and Philosophy, observes in his study of burial practices among African Americans in Hazelhurst, Mississippi, that after preachers are given a chance with their carefully composed sermons, it is then that the evergreen is planted at the grave. These trees are identified with the departed, and if the tree flourishes, all is well with the soul. In other words, the tree stands sentinel above the grave as the immortal presence of the Spirit, an image that graces countless African-American burials. This often overlooked image of the Garden of Golgotha may suggest new ways to understand the soteriological or salvific work of Christ. And here I have a series of questions. Is it possible that the power and significance of the theater of Golgotha in the African-American religious imagination is not ultimately rooted in the traditional Christian narrative of the atonement and the divine victory in the battle between the forces of good and evil? Is it possible that the power of Golgotha lies in the act of the divine, once again, dwelling in the earth? Is it possible that the sting of death is the tragic acknowledgement that we have been estranged from the earth to which we now return? Is it possible that the affirmation that victory has been snatched from the grave is not a repudiation of the earth, but a recovery of its original purpose as a gateway to eternal life? While it is not within the scope of this lecture to pursue these questions, they do point toward new ways of thinking about Christian spirituality and theology. These three gardens point to three distinct stages of the complex relationship between black people and the earth that they inhabit. Eden points to the primordial relationship of black people to the earth, but it is also the site of the discovery of sin as the brokenness that black people experience therein. Gethsemane points to the mediating relationship of black people to the earth, but it is also the site of the blood and tears that black people have historically shed therein. Golgotha points to the final reunion of black people to the earth, not to the pristine place of origin, but as a place that through sacrifice has become redemptive, restorative, holding the possibility of bringing forth new life. In the face of the current ecological crisis, a common question arises among those who seek to mobilize communities to action. Why are black people seemingly disconnected from, or worse, hostile to the current environmentalist movement? For some, this is especially curious as they contemplate the effectiveness of the civil rights movement of the last century as a social movement. And it's also curious, especially since black people are most often negatively affected by our environmental crisis. The question is not easily answered. The answers lie hidden beneath the ugly historical experience of black people in the West in general, and in the United States in particular. While the full exploration of this question lies beyond the scope of this lecture, I want to suggest that the pursuit of a deeper understanding of this issue requires that we examine the ambiguous and problematic association of black people with nature in the colonial mindset, the complex dynamics between traditional African cosmologies and ecologies, and the ongoing quest for justice and balance, which appears consistently in the discourse of black people about the world as divine mandate. So first, I want to talk about, in 2 sections, about black people and nature. One of the major pillars upon which the transatlantic slave trade and the institutionalization of slavery were built was the systemic dehumanization of Africans. The kidnapping, torture, and sale of black bodies were in large part justified by the claim that they were simply part of the vast, untapped natural resources of the region. In order for slavery to function ideologically, Africans had to be stripped of any semblance of humanity. But there is a second requirement in the sinister algorithm of the slave trade. The land on which these people had lived for centuries and from which they were now being taken had to be stripped of its history and purpose. It could no longer be a real place with real people. It had to become a myth. The land whose inhabitants respected the whole of creation, given life by the divine spirit, is now rendered inert, sterile, lifeless for the purposes of conquest. The mythologization of Africa, which allowed the pillaging of its natural and human resources, could have only been possible if the inhabitants were dehumanized. And the dehumanization of Africans was only possible if Africa was mythologized. Such was the relationship between enslaved Africans and the land. One cannot fully understand the limitations of the current ecological movements in the West without attention to the largely untold story of how race and nature intersected in the ideological justification of the Atlantic slave trade. Scholar Paul Alka observed that the intersection of nature and race, perhaps the 2 most perniciously reified constructions in American culture, has yet to be thoroughly examined, and it underscores the long-standing, often normative whiteness of eco-criticism. And that's his quote. Alka goes on to argue that nature, like race, is an artificial construct directed to serve the quest for wealth of a conquering class. This means that slavery depended not only on a set of economic practices and racial practices, but environmental ones. Slavery was part of the grotesque extension of a brutal set of pre-existing environmental assumptions. Enslaved Africans were seen as raw materials to be converted into wealth for their owners. This is what Frederick Douglass intimated when he observed that slaves know as little of their age as horses know of theirs. Slavery required a revaluation of both Africans and nature. The divinity of both had to be denied for the machinery of the institution of slavery to run smoothly. Africans had to be less than human, and Eden had to become an untamed wilderness. But this hegemonic distortion did not completely obliterate the truth about either Africans or nature. It did, however, produce a kind of schizophrenia in the psyche of those conquerors. On the one hand, their culture celebrated nature in its poetry, fine arts, and so forth. Read Walt Whitman, or the whole tradition of nature poetry. On the other hand, the same culture pillaged nature with its economic engines. On one hand, the culture celebrated the triumph of the human spirit in its music and in its literature, while on the other hand, whipping physically and spiritually any slave who dared claim to be fully human. This unexamined love-hate relationship with nature is, I believe, one of the primary reasons that most modern ecological movements are unable to reach their full potential. This assessment of both themselves and their relationship with nature was resisted by enslaved Africans. The trauma of the Middle Passage and the period of seasoning in the Caribbean should not be underestimated. However, deep cultural memories and habits were able to survive. Enslaved Africans did not relinquish their claim to be human and divinely loved, nor did they give up their respect for nature and the land. In the midst of the ecological tragedy of slavery, enslaved Africans adopted and developed ecological practices that contributed to human survival and environmental sustainability. While the slave-holding class viewed enslaved Africans as part of the mechanics of mercantilism, they themselves engaged in practices that demonstrated care for the land. The expanding market for cotton in the U.S. during the 18th and 19th centuries drove the economic development of the plantation system. But the ecological havoc wrought by the unchecked growth of this crop was countered by the ecological practices of those enslaved Africans. For it was enslaved Africans who were often responsible for ridding the field of the pests, weeds, and insects that periodically have population explosions wherever you have a single crop environment. These Africans brought with them to the New World agricultural knowledge and ecological practices that they put to use in this strange land. They learned about the plant life, the seasonal changes, and the topography of the land. They were both able to survive and resist slavery through these practices. They hunted and fished where they could. Sometimes they used blowguns made from sugarcane to hunt. They developed intricate snares and traps to procure food for themselves. And as one scholar said, they hunted every kind of game, but the animals that most commonly found their way into the pots in the quarters were rabbits, raccoons, and opossums. Rabbits were plentiful and had savory meat. Roasted raccoon was rich, textured fare, and the meat of the opossum, when scalded, rubbed in hot ashes, and roasted, and then eaten with roasted sweet potatoes and coffee, was most prized of all. These were not just culinary delights meant to feed the body, but they also had spiritual significance. Food prepared thusly became the center of fellowship and community formation. Some plants had medicinal value and contributed to the healing of the community. Nature offered up its body, and enslaved Africans received it as a sacrament. Nature also provided enslaved Africans with the means to resist their enslavement. Their intimate knowledge of plant life, both toxic and life-sustaining, was at the heart of the terror of many a slave master concerned that they might be poisoned at any moment. Certainly, the informal history of slavery suggests that such instances occurred. However, the point here is that enslaved Africans and nature colluded in their resistance to a system of exploitation bent on destroying them both. This understanding of nature by the enslaved African as the source of nourishment, of life, and resistance to slavery was rooted in their view of nature in general, and plants in particular, as imbued with spiritual power. It was this earthly spirituality that fed the souls of black folk during slavery. It contributed to the innate connection with place for African Americans. And it has been and continues to be a significant part of the cultural longing that periodically manifests itself in the Back to Africa idea. During slavery, black people developed their own indigenous environmental ethic. They participated in their own conservation practices. The idea of the stewardship of the earth was not foreign to them. They were not caught up in the Western theological conundrum of the meaning of dominion in the saga of Genesis, of whether their task was to control the earth or care for the earth. This conundrum was the product of a system of economic exploitation that created a dualism between humanity and the rest of creation. Enslaved Africans, through the irony of history and the providence of God, have been placed on the side of nature. For African Americans, wilderness was not a place in which the preservation of the world could be found, but it was a site of healing, a highway to kinship, a place where a decisive edge of resources could be added to meager plantation rations, a place where salvation could be gained. This place, a wilderness in the hegemonic imagination of their oppressors, became a place where the enslaved African encountered the divine anew. Among African Christians, their preference for holding their worship services down in the hollow or in the clearing, praising God before an inverted pot, or preaching from a tree stump pulpit, was not only the result of the oppressive vectors of slavery, but in many instances because God there was truly present. Ecology in African traditional religion. One cannot fully appreciate the relationship between black people and nature, especially in light of the ecological crisis that we face, without attention to the influence of African traditional religion. One must ask about the idea of God in African traditional religion, the understanding of humanity, and the understanding of nature as part of the created order. Together, these form the basic cosmology that enslaved Africans brought with them to the New World. The seminal work on African traditional religion is John S. Mbede's African Religions and Philosophy, first published in 1969. Although dated, this work has been a touchstone for subsequent treatments of the subject. For the purpose of this lecture, I want to lift up those ideas of God, humanity, and nature that do relate directly to the issue at hand. According to Mbede, God is not only acknowledged as the creator of all that is, God stands as omnipotent. God's power is particularly evident in God's relationship with the natural order. To quote Mbede, among many peoples, God's omnipotence is seen in his exercise of power over nature. And so in this context, power is viewed hierarchically, in which God is at the top as the omnipotent, and beneath God are the spirits, natural phenomena, and lower still are people who have comparatively little or no power at all. This view of God as having dominion, however, is balanced by God's living investment and care for the created order. Seen from this perspective, humanity, rather than being the least of God's creations, becomes the acme of the creative act. Thus, from the perspective of God's immanence, humanity is God's ultimate creation. Mbede further observes that while God is often spoken of in anthropomorphic language, in African traditional religion, God is essentially spirit. It is particularly as spirit that God is incomprehensible. So the Ashanti rightly refer to God as the fathomless spirit, since no human mind can measure God, and no intellect can comprehend or grasp God. God's essential being as spirit is that which God imparts to all of creation, but to humanity, God gives an added measure of responsibility and accountability. While the Spirit of God inhabits all creation, trees, plants, and even other animals, that Spirit inhabits human beings in a special way. This primordial picture of the relationship between Africans and the natural world would seem to suggest that their progeny in the modern world would have a special insight into the current ecological crisis, that they might have some sort of hermeneutical privilege in understanding what should be done to avert environmental disaster. In his important essay, Ecology as Experience in African Indigenous Religions, Edward P. Antonio suggests that this assumption, while romantic, may not be accurate. Mbede's description of the relationship between Africans and the natural world can be read through the lens of myth. That is, one can easily miss the fact that the relationship between Africans and the natural world was never completely symbiotic. In African traditional religions, the relationship between humanity and nature was characterized by divine order. A helpful concept here is Augustine's distinction between uti and frui, UTI and FRUI, the Latin words which I'll define in just a moment. In Augustine's usage, frui, a word which means to enjoy, is contrasted with uti, a word which means to utilize. So frui means specifically to love something for its own sake or as an end in itself, as contrasted with uti, which means to love something for the sake of another, or as a means to a higher end. Frui, in Augustine's thought, is only applied to God, because only God is to be loved for God's own sake. All else is to be loved as a means to an end. In traditional African religion, nature is not the object of frui, only God is. Nature is the object of uti, or utilitarian love. The mere fact that nature was loved was a source of confusion among early European missionaries who mistakenly assumed that Africans worshipped rocks, trees, and inanimate objects. Utilitarian love recognized the sustenance that nature provided for human flourishing. This did not mean that nature was to be left in its pristine state, but that the process of production in the natural world recognized the interdependence of humans and that natural world. Within this productive activity, Africans recognized that the demands of the spirits about how nature shall be treated in the process of production were important. This relationship of utilitarian love is very different from the Western understanding of nature as the subject of conquest, or in biblical language, dominion. This relationship of utilitarian love precludes a dominating attitude towards nature. The idea that black people are closer to nature and therefore may have an inherent ecological consciousness is supported by neither experience nor reason. The relationship of black people to nature is not intended to preserve the natural realm from the ravages of modern ecological irresponsibility. The relationship is part of a larger cosmic ecology intended to point towards God. The artificially contrived notion of an idealized relationship of Africans with nature was a violation of the cosmologies of African religion, because both nature and Africans were now nothing more in the sight of their conquerors than raw materials for the hegemony of the West. The primary relationship of enslaved Africans with nature was one of coexistence, though not without mutual demands, which any relationship entails. The transatlantic slave trade, a unique phenomenon in human history, required a substantial adaptation of traditional religious ideas for the survival of enslaved Africans. Our current ecological crisis, equally unique in the history of the planet, will require that indigenous notions of the relationship between Africans and nature also be radically adapted. As is true in any such adaptation, something new must be added and something traditional must be retained. In this case, what must be added is the sober recognition that our understanding of the natural realm has been shaped by an industrial capitalism powered by an imperialist post-colonial mindset. What must be retained is the conviction that the natural realm can be the site of the encounter between the truly human and the genuinely divine. This is the essence of the earthly spirituality of black folk. Nowhere is this spirituality more evident than in the thought of African-American mystic Howard Thurman. Thurman's spirituality, which is truly an African-derived, grounded spirituality, recognizes the inherent relationship between humanity and nature. And I will quote him directly here. Man cannot long separate himself from nature without withering as a cut rose in a vase. One of the deceptive aspects of mind in man is to give him the illusion that being distinct from and over against, but not a part of nature. It is but a single step thus to regard nature as being so completely other than himself that he may exploit it, plunder it, and violate it with impunity. The earthly spirituality of black folk is funded by the values of African traditional religions and shaped in the forge of black experience in the modern world. The question before us now is, where can we find expressions of this spirituality that can help us respond to the environmental crisis before us? It is to this last question that we now turn. In search of our mother's garden, eco-womanism and the environmental challenge. In the 1970s, novelist and essayist, poet Alice Walker introduced the term womanist into the American cultural vocabulary. The term reflected the importance of the perspective of black women in understanding black experience. The concept provided a lens which highlighted both the differences and connections between the experience of black women and that of white feminists. It also highlighted the differences between the experience of black women and that of black men. Walker provides a definition of the term that continues to be the source of new connotations and denotations even today. A womanist is, she says, a black feminist or feminist of color, one who engages in outrageous, audacious, courageous, or willful behavior, wanting to know more and in greater depth than is considered good for one, interested in grown-up doings, acting grown-up, being grown-up, responsible, in charge, serious.
My.
Walker goes on to describe a womanist as one who is committed to the survival and wholeness of entire people, male and female. And she concludes that womanist is to feminist and purple is to lavender. The concept of womanist has become a touchstone for a multidisciplinary conversation regarding the historical and contemporary experience of women of color. Womanism is the name for the intellectual and cultural movement and commitment to give voice to the complexity and depth of black women's experience and knowledge. Eco-womanism is a name given to the perspective of black women on the ecological challenges which we face in the world today. A leading scholar in this area, Melody L. Harris, describes eco-womanism as an approach to environmental ethics that centers on the perspectives, theoethical analysis, and life experiences of women of color, specifically the voices of African-descended women, as they contribute new ideas, theories, and ideas, contribute new attitudes, theories, and ideas about how to face ecological crises. Certainly, eco-womanists are not alone among women in their concern for the environment. The eco-feminist movement is well documented and shares many of the commitments of eco-womanists. Both eco-feminists and eco-womanists address the ideological and religious links between women and the earth, for example. However, eco-womanism excludes specific and intentional prioritizing of the experience of black women, including the gifts that they bring to addressing our environmental concerns. Eco-womanism explores the relationship between the violence historically experienced by women of color and violence against the earth. Eco-womanism argues that there is a relationship between violence against the earth, the exploitation of nature, and the experience of black women. Historically, black women have been associated with animality, with nature, and with the earth. This constructed association has been the source of both fear and fascination with black women's bodies. In the poignant words of Zora Neale Hurston, black women have been viewed as the mules of the world. Black women have been associated with nature in a way that hid rather than enhanced their humanity. And black women have been associated with the earth in a way that rendered them politically vulnerable. Eco-womanists seek to debunk these falsehoods, the falsehoods behind these assumptions, and to recover the innate resources for survival and liberation in black women's experience. The historical association of black women with nature has been problematic. But as Shamara Shantu Riley observes in her attractively titled essay, ecology is a sister's issue too. Black womanists must confront the dilemma of whether we should strive to sever or reinforce the traditional association of black people with nature that exists in dominant Western thought. However, what we need is not a total dissociation of people from nature, but rather a reformulation of everyone's relationship to nature by socially reconstructing gender, class, and ethnic roles. There is no use in womanists advocating liberation politics if the planet cannot support people's liberated lives. And it is equally useless to advocate saving the planet without addressing the social issues that determine the structure of human relations in the world. If the planet as a whole is to survive, we must begin to see ourselves as interconnected with non-human nature and with one another. Alice Walker's early work did not address ecological concerns explicitly, but womanism cannot be properly appreciated without attention to the inherent earthly spirituality of black folk. Walker describes her mother's garden as the goal of her spiritual search. And I quote here, "My mother adorned with flowers whatever shabby house we were forced to live in. And not just your typical straggly country stand of zinnias either. She planted ambitious gardens, and still does, with over 50 different varieties of plants that bloom profusely from early March until late November. Before she left home for the field, she watered her flowers, chopped up the grass, and laid out new beds. When she returned from the fields, she might divide clumps of bulbs, dig a culture pit, uproot and replant roses, or prune branches from her taller bushes or trees until night came and it was too dark to see. Whatever she planted grew as if by magic, and her fame as a grower of flowers spread over 3 counties. Because of her creativity with her flowers, even my memories of poverty are seen through a screen of blooms: sunflowers, petunias, roses, dahlias, forsythias, spirea, delphiniums, verbena, and so on. And I remember people coming to my mother's yard to be given cuttings from her flowers. I hear again the praise showered on her because whatever rocky soil she landed on, she turned it into a garden. A garden so brilliant with colors, so original in its design, so magnificent with life and creativity that to this day, people drive by our house in Georgia, perfect strangers and imperfect strangers, and ask to stand or walk among my mother's art. I notice that it is only when my mother is working in her flowers that she is radiant, almost to the point of being invisible, except as creator, hand and eye. She is involved in her work. She is involved in work that her soul must have, ordering the universe in the image of her personal conception of beauty. End of quote. Walker's description of her mother's garden with its allusions to Eden reminds us of the healing and sustaining potential of the earth we inhabit. It reminds us that our efforts to care for the earth cannot be separated from our efforts to care for ourselves. The garden reminds us that the ultimate purpose of creation, including nature, is to reflect the glory of its creator. If ecological disaster is to be averted, we must view the earth in more than material terms. We must see that the earth has its own spirituality. In conclusion, the Bible begins in a garden and ends in a city. This ending is a sobering and hopeful reminder that the point of our journey is not always a return to some pristine setting where the effects of history and humanity have been wiped away, but the mandate to create and sustain an environment in spite of the effects of history and humanity. An environment where justice reigns. This movement away from the view of nature as untamed, inert, and lifeless, towards a view of nature as purposeful, diverse, and living, requires that we recognize and accept the fact that the pristine garden from which we sprang, metaphorically speaking, is no longer available to us. It has, in the symbology of the Bible, been closed and is now guarded by angels with two flaming swords. However, as the book of Revelation reminds us, the city to which we are called has within its walls a garden. It is a place of devotion and not domination. It is a place of exaltation and not exploitation. We may come to the garden alone, but we leave to join nature in manifold witness to the God whose promise makes redemption possible for us all. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Evans. We have time for some questions. And what we're going to do is anyone who would like to get up and ask a question, we have the mic central here. So if you could come up and do that. For anyone who wants to stay in their seat, I'm going to be coming around with some little slips of paper. If you want to write a question, we will then read it aloud and have Dr. Evans address it that way.
Hi, Dr. I just wanted to ask, in your preparation for this lecture or in just your classes, what about someone like George Washington Carver? You think about all the references he made to God. Some people thought he was a little crazy for not exploiting the discoveries that he had. Can you address that?
Oh, I think that's really just an excellent observation. I do need to confess that one of the things that I actually both liked and stressed about this preparation was my own lack of knowledge in the area. So this was one, and a chance for me to read in an area that I had not done much reading in. And so what I presented to you was basically what I could pull together between the time I was at now with me. So, but those things all flow in. So when I think about George Washington Carver, the great sort of agricultural scientist, I think my theory that enslaved Africans brought their own environmental practices with them would not have been lost on Dr. Carver. I think those are the things that I think that he would have employed, whether he named them or not. Current scholarship, however, is beginning to uncover documented instances of that happening. There's documentation of the kind of ecological practices that enslaved Africans used on the land. So I think that's just another place to really do some exploration.
Dr. Evans, thank you for the wisdom that you shared with us today. As we consider generations coming behind us, our younger people, what wisdom would you share with us as we try to make clear to young people as they grow and consider their responsibility?
Yeah. Well, I think relative to this one issue, I think it has to begin early. It has to begin with the kind of retraining because as I intimated, that the whole view of the natural world as something simply to be exploited, to be dominated, to be turned from raw materials into what the economists call value, is something that needs to be looked at again. And I think part of what I know I have to do, and those who work in our field here at the Divinity School, is to begin to think theologically about what that means. I think other scientists and other fields have to think about what that means for them. But I think there's a reconceptualization of the natural realm. I think it's going to be important. The real issue for me, especially if you're dealing with the young people in the communities that I come from, is you've got to find a way to connect this. See, it's not, I mean, if I can come and give a speech on sustainability of the earth and ecological practices and the dangers of fracking and do all of that, and you're going to get a blank look from people whose basic issue of the day is they haven't been able to find a job. So I think the real key is going to be, how do you connect that? And so that this is not something that is being imposed on us. This is a value flowing from us. And that's why that education has to take place at an early age.
Well, he's getting ready. Let me ask a quick question about sort of urban issues. Both as a theologian and as an urban pastor. What do you see as some of the really urgent ecological and environmental challenges that are impacting urban centers where a garden can't grow because the air is too stagnant?
Yeah, and I think that's the case. I think in a way this may turn out to be as big as the issue of reparations. Because for well over 100 years, parts of our communities have been intentionally polluted. And the effects of that are multi-generational. And so I think, there will be ways in which taking responsibility for that will be resisted. But I think the fact is that we don't know yet, science has not agreed on it yet, but whether or not some of the health maladies in our own communities are the result of really living in more toxic environments. And so I think that's going to be a big theological issue. It's going to be a big ethical moral issue. It's going to be a global issue. Because I know some of you may be familiar, but a few years back, the then president, President Summers of Harvard, who was a scientist himself, gave a speech in which he made a really kind of controversial statement. He said that Africa is significantly underpolluted. Now, if you understand what that means that we have run out in places where it's politically advantageous for us to dump our toxic waste in the West. So we're looking for someplace else to dump it. So that phrase that Africa is significantly underpolluted tells me that the threat is becoming globalized. So, I mean, I think this is really kind of a big deal, but we have to find a way, one, to connect this to our own communities by really elucidating that this is a value that comes out of us, but not as imposed on us. Because I think people always resist somebody else's agenda being imposed on them, but when they understand that their foreparents knew how to live in a productive relationship with the land, and that is still in them, I think at least we have a point at which to begin the conversation.
Dr. Evans, thank you for your lecture and the insights, the wisdom you brought. I hope I phrased this right. I think it's two parts. The movement and the sustainability of the ecosystem suggests that our resources, natural resources, in terms of the garden, are being pushed to the margins. Can you talk a little bit more about that and the estrangement of Black people from that movement and the marginalized?
Yeah.
And the second part of that, in terms of indigenous Africans and we're understanding of God as creator and we're as part of the natural earth, and how we view that in terms of the ecosystem, margins being marginalized, and the context of God.
Yeah.
I think I got that right.
Okay. Well, I'll try. I'll get it at my best shot. Yeah, there has been a level of frustration among within the sort of traditional ecological movement that there's been difficulty in getting people of color excited about that. I think there are a couple of reasons for that. One is that if the issue of the care for the earth is separated from the issue of care for people,
Yes.
you're just not going to get a lot of buy-in to that. That's just not going to happen. The second reason, however, and this is kind of an ideological reason, is that the ecological movement, like many of the movements coming out of the middle of the last century, are essentially Enlightenment movements. They're really rooted in a kind of awareness, growing education about the consequences of our action. And there's nothing wrong with that, but they are an Enlightenment movement. But as such, Enlightenment movements don't really have room for the vocabulary of spirituality. So these Enlightenment movements tend to base themselves on science and things that can be measured. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, but if you're appealing to a group of people whose way of dealing with the material reality is really by searching for the kind of spiritual core of it, and you simply dismiss that, then I think that's where part of the problem is. And to be fair, many of the more recently published scholars are realizing that. That this really is about, that's why I call it the earthly spirituality of black folk. This is really about understanding that this is not just a material matter, this is a spiritual matter.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Irvin, so much for speaking about such an important subject as our ecology. In Detroit, in particular, where they've had some really hard times recently, there's a lot of community gardens springing up.
Yeah, they are.
And here in Rochester, like Emmanuel Baptist Church, has 3 gardens over in the Forest Fells area for the past couple of years, and hopes to expand on that. So I'd like you to just hear your thoughts about community gardens as a way for people to reconnect with the earth.
Well, I think they're a really good idea, large or small. We don't have any like little green space at the church where I'm connected, but we did find like a little piece of ground that didn't have concrete on it a few years back. We had the young people plant, tomatoes and peppers and stuff. And first of all, it grew quickly, and we invited people from the neighborhood to just come take what you need. And this was a small piece of ground. So you can imagine what a larger community garden can do. For Detroit, I know one of being my hometown and been just, I've followed and been a part, that is who I am and what I am. Part of the economic realignment in the city of Detroit has meant that it has lost significant population. So it has thousands and thousands of homes that are empty, which will never be sold because they're not going to be able to buy it. So they've had to think about what they're going to do. And one of the urban plans was to basically compact the city and then surround it by urban gardens. That is to recreate an agricultural environment for that. That's a great plan, but we know that the devil is in the details. Getting people who don't have any real vested interest in anything to simply sign over title to those abandoned properties is just more difficult. And not everybody's committed to that as well. But I think in the long run, just for us as churches, I think even symbolically, the image of a garden symbolically says something. And so it's not that you have to feed everybody. You like to feed as many as you could, but symbolically, it says that we understand that the earth is the Lord's in the full extent. We're kind of part of that.
Amen.
James, you and I were colleagues for many years.
Yes.
And the one thing that doesn't happen, we don't listen to our colleagues very much in terms of their lectures and so on. And I just want to thank you today for what's been an inspiring experience of you as the way you have opened up this whole subject area.
Amen.
And I wanted to also... And I love the emphasis here upon the inherent spirituality of nature. And there I think about the Psalms. All the trees of the field will clap their hands. And you look through the Psalms, and on the one hand you have that exuberant rejoicing. At the same time there is realization of all the struggle of human life. The Psalms, as we know, are just this fullness of life.
Yeah.
But to emphasize that spirituality of that, I think can move us in the direction you'd like to see us go. And I want to thank you very much.
Well, thank you. And thank you for that reference to Psalms. While I was preparing this, I ran across one of the commentaries that I did for feasting on the Word, and I was assigned to do a theological commentary on the Psalm. And one of the things that I noted in that commentary is that one scholar said there was a point in the history of Israel in which it shifted its emphasis from God as a God of nature to God as a God of history. And we see some of that transition in Psalms, although the God as God of nature never really completely was absent. There was more of an emphasis on the God of history. And I think that's one of the things that we can kind of think about in terms of how our own way of thinking about God and God's relationship to the world is actually shaped. Because if it's only about historical processes, then we forget that God inhabits everything.
Dr. Evans, in relation to the Black experience, I just wanted to mention to you and ask you a question in terms of Yamas. Y-A-M-A-S, Yamas. They are indigenous to Africa, brought here and changed to yams.
Yeah.
And some call them sweet potatoes.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering if now they have become a standard soul food item. Do you see that some of the foods that we eat give us a spiritual connection to nature?
Well, you know, Dr. Gail Shakes, she's right here. She's a graduate and also a friend of mine, a member of the church. I would say this: eating at her house is a spiritual experience. It's a spiritual experience. But yes, because even the food itself, and one of the things that I'm reading about this is that not just the kinds of food, although you can look at what the general makeup of greens and sweet potatoes or yams, as we call them, are important, but they provided fellowship. I'm reminded of a phrase from Ralph Ellison's novel, Invisible Man. And the Invisible Man has a narrator who is not named, but he's walking down the streets of Harlem, and he goes to one of the stands where you can go, you get a sweet potato or a yam, and they fix it up for you with the butter and everything on it. And he bites into it and he says, "I yam what I can." It's a very powerful very powerful statement, because in many ways he's combining, if you notice, he's combining the sort of traditional African symbol of the yam, you know, with the sort of traditional Western philosophical affirmation of human identity. So, and I think in many ways it was the food that helped us and continues to help us. It's amazing for many of you who kind of grew up in these kinds of environments. You know what you did Sunday afternoon after church, right? You had this huge meal. It reminded me that itself must have been a kind of sacrament. Must have been a kind of sacramental observance to go and have that meal together. And it was not only that you had a meal together, it's what was served that was important.
Dr. Evans, we have several questions here that were written for us, so I will read them one at a time. Can you expound upon the similarities between violence against black women and violence against the earth?
Yes, similarities. One, a matter of ownership. Just a matter of ownership. Frederick Douglass, in his 1845 narrative, describes kind of horrific flogging of his Aunt Hester. And he talks about the blood kind of coming down off her back into the ground. And, you know, this is the same ground that's being exploited. This is the same ground where the chemical balance is being altered by single crops being grown over and over again without giving the land a chance to rest and recover. And so it's a symbolic kind of connection. And there's always been this kind of association. This has been true of femininity and the earth in Western thought in general. And it's that there's something about the earth. I mean, this was the reason that many women were accused of being witches. And it simply had to do with this sort of connection to the earth. So when you think about that and you multiply that in terms of the experience of African American women, that connection is there. This is something I own. This is like the earth as far as I'm concerned.
What can CRCDS do to speak out as custodians of the earth on topics such as fracking and the carrying of back in crude oil, which is highly explosive by transit that passes through our city? Are we not custodians of the earth?
Well, you know, I know that we are not the only place that's talking about these matters in this particular season. And I need to say that I'm glad that our school is having this kind of conversation. I'm not sure that there are many divinity schools, other places that are devoting serious time and attention to this particular issue. I think, like everything else, that if we challenge each other as we go about our teaching, our preaching, and our work, to think about what it means to look at the matter, look at the text from this perspective, to talk about issues of justice, to really understand the interconnection between social injustice and ecological injustice, because they really are connected. Somebody makes a decision to put a toxic dump in your neighborhood, or even better, my favorite one is because we've got a site here in Rochester, I don't even see where it is, but it's been closed off for many, many years, and it's been surrounded by a fence, and there was a sign up saying that this land had been contaminated because there had been some oil tanks or something else that leaked. And one day the signs were gone. One day the signs were gone, which meant that at some place somebody decided that this land was no longer toxic and that you could build something on it. And so to me, my question about that is, who made that decision? And on what basis did you make that decision? Did it become safe overnight? So I think as we begin to really ask those kinds of questions, and then in whose neighborhood? In whose neighborhood did those those happen. We, as a community, it is really our job to explore the questions. Explore the questions and not settle for the easy answers. And I think this gives us another set of questions to explore.
Thank you. Okay, the next question. In the beginning of your lecture, you repeated a verse from I Come to the Garden Alone. The refrain says, He walks with me and He talks with me. Could you say something about the anthropomorphic aspect of Black spirituality?
That's a good question. Because in traditional African religions, as well as in African American Christianity, the notion of a disembodied spirituality is foreign. Spirituality is always embodied. It always has some form to it. So even the connotation of walking with me and talking with me, very important. It does not mean that God is any less divine, but it means that God is connected to us in a way that we recognize. And so the spirituality is always embodied. And this is why I think that even in talking about Pauline theology, which I was reading not long ago before this, and what Paul was saying about the Spirit, sometimes Paul gets read through our own eyes. He gets read through 20th century post-colonial eyes. And this whole notion of contrasting the flesh of the spirit and the body, I think gets out of whack, out of balance. I know that on Easter Sunday, we talked about the resurrection, but we talked about the resurrection of the body. And what Paul talked about is a spiritual body. So I think that our spirituality has to be embodied. That's why I talked about the title, the earthly spirituality. It has form, it has shape, it has substance. And I think that is one of the distinguishing features.
Okay, the next question. Every year, the Friends of Frederick Douglass sponsors an Arbor Day program here in Rochester, where Rochester Daycare Center children are treated to the concept of horticulture, and the Monroe Parks, and then invited to plant their own flowers there in Frederick Douglass Triangle. Are there similar programs for city youth to teach and expose in the Rochester faith community?
I don't know. I think it's a good question to ask those gathered here and maybe those who are on our mailing list in terms of what they're doing. But I don't know. But I think that as much as we could do that, I think that would be something that would be beneficial.
Can you elaborate on the moral and ethical issues of genocide and Black ecology?
Genocide?
Genocide.
This is really it's been in the news a lot, at least the thing that I'm referring to. And that is sort of the tragic mass killings on the African continent. And as I've tried to painfully try to understand what are the sort of true motivations behind that, it does draw me back to the fact that we've had unfortunate genocidal episodes throughout the last couple of 100 years. And what is actually behind that. I can only say that I think that the only way genocide happens is that you have to dehumanize. And part of that dehumanization means that I associate them with the ground, the dirt, the earth, which is mine to do with as I will. And so I think that's where we have to be aware of those dynamics. I think they have to make their way into our preaching. We have to at least raise the questions before our congregation that this gives us a different way of thinking about it, that we can think about it a different way. we can deepen our belief, and then we can strengthen our witness. So I think, you know, if we pay attention to those things, that I think they will, that it will help us find a response to that.
We have time for one or two more questions. Are there any that are written, or someone who would like to come up to the microphone?
Can I ask a question following this up?
Sure.
Is this not also tied to the earth in terms of the resources under which each group of these people are living?
You're talking about
Yes,
about
I'm
the,
following up what you said.
yeah, well, certainly in a situation where you have intense competition for what are scarce resources, I think yes, you're going to have that. But I think to find a way to justify it still requires a kind of dehumanization. In order to make a decision that this group of people should be eliminated so that my group of people can survive a little longer, we still requires a kind of justification.
What it reminds me of us how happy we were that the Indians were fighting each other because then they both had gone and we have the land. And I just, that kind of is in my mind in terms of the rest of the world, looking at the minerals and things that are available because we need it.
Yeah. Well, you know, I think on the African continent, it is particularly interesting that you have people fighting for scarce resources when it is a land of tremendous wealth and abundance. But, you know, the means of production, we'll use that language, does not lie into the hands of people. And I think this is, you know, this is what happens. I hadn't really thought about it, but if I hadn't thought about it, I would have said something about it this morning. As an example of dry homes and fertile fields, that you have that. You have that tremendous poverty in a land where there is gold, diamonds, and you know, all kinds of precious metals and materials. So it does say something about that. Yes.
Other questions that we have? Okay, I was just handed a note about an opportunity here for people in Rochester on April 25th at Christ Church on East Avenue at 6 p.m. and that's an interfaith celebration of the earth in prayer and song. So there are many things out in the community, and so we're happy to pass an opportunity like this along. Any other questions before we close this session? Okay, I'm going to move my way up to the front. Oh, we have one. This will be the last question.
Yes, it's not a question, but on April 21st, James Hansen of the Goddard Space Institute is going to be at Monroe Community College speaking, and he's one of the top scientists as far as the global warming issue. Be an opportunity for us to hear it.
We're fortunate at Colgate Rochester Crozier to have people like Dr. Evans who are able to take part in our lecture series, and this is something that we intentionally do to include our faculty and to recognize their expertise and to share that with the broader community as well. I have a couple of quick housekeeping orders to take. The first one is evaluations. You each have an evaluation at your seat. If you could fill that out and just leave it there, we will go ahead and collect those from you. But if you would take the time to fill that out, it helps us to better plan, better programming to respond to your needs as well. Coming up next in our beginning lectures, we have our two options starting at 3:30. One is to go and look and visit the Lamberton Conservatory, which is over in Highland Park. Anyone that would like to go, it's just pretty much straight out our driveway and into Highland Park, and you'll see the conservatory on the right-hand side. If you tell them you're visiting from Colgate Rochester Crozier, they will not charge you. and you can go ahead and enjoy the beautiful flowers that we know are promised outside, but right now the conservatory's got them inside, so you can have another Easter moment by going inside. Another opportunity is at the Unitarian Church on Winton Road, and we have maps and brochures on the table outside for people who want to see how a church can use its resources, its physical land, to give back to the community and to sustain its own community. Obviously, given the weather, it's not very much of a garden right now, but it always gives you an opportunity to see what they can do. At the same time, we will have in this room a forum on sustainability, and today's group is from Greentopia. And Greentopia is doing a number of initiatives here in Rochester, mainly around the High Falls area, looking at how sustainability can meet many different community needs, from revitalization to economic development to fighting obesity. There are many, many ways that sustainability continues to heal our community, and they will provide a great opportunity for us to see their programs as well. Tonight we'll be back in here for the first of our Stuber lectures. And tonight we welcome Dr. Ilya Delio, and we invite you to come back 7 o'clock. If you aren't able to join us tonight, you can come back tomorrow morning for chapel at 10:30. If you are, I won't read the entire brochure because those of us who put it together know we've got 3 packed days. But if you want to see the full schedule and walk around with it, we have these brochures out on the table outside the lecture hall right now. And that is it. We will be around if you have any questions for us. And I'm going to ask the class of 1965 if you can just meet me down here before you leave the lecture hall. That would be perfect. Thank you so much for coming. We're delighted you're here and look forward to seeing you throughout the week.